of society. The members of the marginalized communities can also be institutionally humiliated, not merely by using the tool of law, but also by establishments that further a conducive environment for discrimination and humiliation to be perpetuated. Even if a discriminatory law is held unconstitutional by the courts or is repealed by Parliament, the discriminatory behavioral pattern is not immediately overturned. The British Raj enacted the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871, through which a tribe, gang, or class of persons addicted to the systemic commission of offences were notified. Once a tribe was notified, then all the members belonging to the tribe were required to register themselves. The Criminal Tribes Act was later repealed in 1949, once our constitution was enacted and the tribes were denotified. However, even after nearly 73 years since the tribes were denotified, the members of the tribes are still subject to oppression and cruelty. Members of the denotified tribes are still picked up by the investigating officers to cover up shoddy investigations. The Supreme Court in Ankush Maruti versus the state of Maharashtra allowed a review petition filed against the conviction of 6 accused persons on rape and murder charges. The decision judicially recognized that the members of the nomadic tribes, the NTs or the DTNTs as we call them in Maharashtra, belonging to the lower strata of the society, are regularly harassed by investigating agencies by using the forces of criminal law. The Constitution does not initiate change, but it permits and accommodates change. The Constitution was created in a social order dominated by hierarchical power structures. It tells us a story of freedom, of liberty, of independence. But it also tells us a story of subordination, subservience, and lawlessness. The personhood conferred to members of the marginalized groups would be diminished unless we recognize and abolish, in spirit, the unequal power structures which facilitate humiliation. Pertinently, the preamble of our Constitution begins with the phrase, "We the people of India." But who are the people of India? In 1990, the US Supreme Court in United States versus Verdugo-Urquidez was concerned with an application seeking protection against an unreasonable search and seizure under the Fourth Amendment. In that case, a Mexican national was arrested by the United States enforcement officials and his residence in Mexico was searched by them. The majority judgment dismissed the argument by carving a class of people from the class of persons. The Supreme Court observed, the people protected by the Fourth Amendment refers to a class of persons who are part of the national community or who have otherwise developed sufficient connection with his country to be considered a part of the community. Thus, I often wonder if the people referred to in the preamble of the Constitution includes the tribes, which were still recognized as notified tribes when the Constitution came into force. Does it include the homosexuals? Does it include the women, the Dalit community, and the disabled in truth? Unlike the Western democracies, where the right to vote was granted gradationally to different classes of people after a protracted political struggle, our Constitution granted universal adult suffrage to all Indian citizens. However, this was not without its detractors in the Constituent Assembly. And we shouldn't lose sight of the Constituent Assembly debates. Numerous voices in the Constituent Assembly echoed against the proposal to grant universal adult suffrage. Their arguments were centered around the supposed ignorance and lack of rationality of the members of certain communities. One of the members of the Constituent Assembly, Mr. Frank Anthony, in the context of universal adult suffrage remarked, "Democracy," he said, "democracy has always carried the postulate, the implication, that at least the exercise of the franchise would be made, if not on an essentially rationalistic basis, would be made at least on a common sense basis." Hence, some members of our Constituent Assembly were indeed of the opinion that certain classes of groups of people in India did not possess the rationality to make informed decisions and choices. As I had mentioned earlier, the externalization component of personhood requires both the law and the society to recognize a person. Thus, personhood cannot be said to have been granted to members of the marginalized communities in India when the constitution came into effect, in spite of including the provisions such as Article 14, 17 and 326, when a segment of India did not, and probably still does not, recognize the ability of the marginalized sections to live as rational human beings who deserve their respect. Google tells us that personhood is a quality or condition of being an individual person. Such a characterization in Google of personhood considers it as an individual and universal concept. However, I do not agree with this characterization of personhood. I think that personhood is a group right that is granted based on the political will of the powerful. Indeed, was personhood ever in the history of mankind granted to individuals? I cannot think of any such instance where an individual was granted personhood by the law and society. Personhood is always vested in groups or classes of people: the blacks, the women, the Dalits, the tribes, and the homosexuals. It is the granting of legal and social recognition to individuals based on their membership of social groups. These groups were granted diminished personhood at some point in the history of mankind. Personhood is thus never granted to or taken away from one individual. Consequently, an individual's membership in these groups also becomes a part of their identity and who they are. These groups or collectives can take different shapes and forms. Some of these can be as basic as belonging to the same school or college, while others can over time become extremely complex institutions in themselves, such as religion, caste, or race. Having argued that the members of the marginalized groups possess diminished personhood because of social and institutional marginalization, an appropriate approach to tackle this problem needs to be ascertained. The assimilation or obliviousness of group identity would not rectify the problem of diminished personhood. Treating every person as an individual, irrespective of their differences, and members of multiple groups would not be sufficient to gain personhood, because it would be ignoring the lived realities for those for whom their membership in such groups is a crucial part of their identity. Hence, members of the marginalized communities would be able to gain complete personhood only by the assertion and recognition of their group identities. And I believe that was the visionary ideal which Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar pursued. The international framework